Hey everybody, it's Professor Diffley, History 100, Chapter 3. This is the Part 4 video. Alright, so we're still talking about Sophists. Now we're on Sophists and religion. Continuing Protagoras. Excuse me. Protagoras was also a proponent of agnosticism. This is something straight off that is greatly misunderstood. There are two concepts: agnosticism and atheist. Most people do not understand the difference for some reason. An atheist is sure there is no higher power, like a god. Agnostics, on the other hand, think of something completely different. Agnostics are, for some reason, always considered atheist. And I guarantee there's some of you that want to argue with me about this. That no, agnostics do not believe in God. Sorry, it's just not true. So this is the argument that the belief that the supernatural phenomena are unknowable. That the even religious beliefs need to be through evidence. And that but here, look at it this way. Agnostics are skeptics, but that doesn't mean they reject the idea of a divine power. Instead, the argument is that you'll never be able to convince me that your belief in God and your conception of them is any more accurate than mine. So therefore, since these things are unknowable, because we can't test them, there's no evidence, it's a matter of faith, then discussions and debates are pointless and fruitless. Again, so that's really it. Agnosticism argues that we cannot understand or know the divine. Therefore, fighting over it is pointless. I mean, it's like trying to teach calculus to a goldfish. It ain't going to work. Why? We are higher than a goldfish. If there is a God, then it is higher than us, and we cannot understand it completely. So that's what they're getting at here. But this is a distrust, because, again, these are very religious. They believe the gods intervene in their lives all the time, so the fear is that this would anger the gods. And we're going to see, this is... later, Socrates is accused of all of this. Some more video images here. Socrates. So let's talk about Socrates. Most famous of the Golden Age philosophers, first philosopher to focus on ethics, devoted his life to questioning people about their beliefs. He comes up with the Socratic method of teaching, which we don't always do, but it's teaching through conversation in which he asks probing questions to make listeners examine their most cherished beliefs and assumptions. What's the point here? Force people to admit they did not, in fact, know what they assumed they knew very well, right? You might believe something, but there's nothing to necessarily always back it up, so to speak, there. He insisted he's not a sophist because he did not accept pay, and because he said he did not have anything to teach. He said that true wisdom is recognizing that you do not know anything. What does he mean for this? By you not knowing anything? He's arguing that you can always learn, right? That, again, a lot of what we believe we know is really assumptions. So he's arguing he's not a teacher here, right? There's also that if you think you know everything, you're never going to grow, you're never going to learn, that sort of thing. Argue for universal truths and morals. He said, there is certain things that are right and wrong. He said to behave, to true happiness is, behave in accordance with universal standards of just behavior that we can understand rationally, right? He upsets many, especially his questioning, really made people feel stupid at times, or what often happened is his students would go home and do this to their parents. So it's a never-ending questioning, getting you to break down what you believe, and then build it back up through evidence and things like this. They still use it to a degree in law school, and can be quite terrifying for people to do. But he also ridiculed Greek and Athenian values, especially this idea of arete and personal wealth and power. He says that's the wrong things to be focusing on, right? That is about individualism and not really the way to go. So again, you can see him questioning things there. You do get history writing for the first time here. Herodotus, the father of history, he wrote the histories. History is a Greek word for inquiry. Just find people when it's his story. No. History means inquiries, and that's what history is. We're inquiring, looking, and questioning about the past. He wrote a history of the Greco-Persian Wars. He's the first to characterize these wars as a clash between East and West, something that still continues today. You saw this in the Cold War, the East and West. There's some that are for one side and the others, and never can they meet, that the cultures and values are so different there. Again, people still view it this way. I'm not sure it's true, but this is that idea that there's a clash between cultures. He takes an investigative approach. He studies culture, human psychology, humans' interactions rather than the gods. Again, he sees that's the reasons for these clashes. He takes a more human-centered approach and really does do it investigative here. Thucydides is another one of these. He wrote really about contemporary history, invented the kind of analysis of power that we have today in political science. This is a little bit more of the modern way to do things. He wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War, which war between Sparta and Athens. He focused on power politics, not divine intervention. So what's he saying? Why did Athens and Sparta go to war? They were both competing to be the most powerful in all of Greece and in that part of the world. And so eventually they were going to come and butt heads over this. He, many interviews and inquiries using only reliable sources. He would offer both sides of things and say, well, I don't know if you should believe this one or another because of this. There's biases. He also argued that, we need to look at not just on grand achievements, but the negative or more shameful aspects of life and why people do things. Thucydides is popular today. Again, there's a book out there, the Thucydides Trap, that looks at this as power politics. Again, people use it as an argument of why the U.S. and China are on a collision course. That's a side note, but this is a very, very important way. But this is why we study history. Again, we're trying to figure out the past, and this analysis of power. What motivates people? Money, access to resources, domination of others. There. You do get Greek tragedy. These are plays presented over 3 days, often. Again, everything's a contest, so you have a contest here. Written in verse. Prizes include those for best actor, protagonist, meaning first competitor. Only rich men, it could be playwrights, and I really do mean men for this era there. Why? You had to put these all on, and also just to write, all the time, you had to have the resources to be independently wealthy. Had to create 4 plays in these contests, especially for Dionysus. Why? This is why most sports have a series rather than the Super Bowl. Because anybody can win on any given day. You can do one thing great once, but it's better to be able to do it over a series, right? So you write 4 plays. You want to make sure that you can come up with more than once. They were given outdoors during the day. Why? No electric light. And notice that there's always, so the Dionysian competition, you do 3 tragedies, a trilogy, and then a comedy. Why end on the comedy? Because tragedies always end up with tragedy. And so, lighter note there. No female actors. Everybody played there by men. Tragedies present shocking stories, fierce conflict, usually from myth, but they could relate to contemporary Athens. Comedies will be ones that look at contemporary people. Tragedy use myth rather than everyday folks. There's often usually a resolution, but only after tremendous suffering, right? It really did challenge viewers to see what choices these people made. Were they arrogant, ignorant, or violent? This is hubris is what usually brings them down. Vivid spectacles, they did have special effects like flames and, people on harnesses moving across the stage. And we've talked about hubris, but yeah, main topic, Greek term for violent arrogance, suffering not only for the protagonist, but everyone around them. Most characters suffer not because they're evil, but they made errors in that. And so that's the point of tragedy, is to see it and to avoid it in the future. You do have comedies here. These are contemporary issues, public policies, and criticisms of public officials. This is like satire. Think of Saturday Night Live, The Daily Show, things like that, where they go after and make fun of not common folks, but politicians and things like this. This is a way to satirize them, make fun of what they're doing. Again, they had comic fantasies meant to be grotesque unreality. Again, sort of taking life and then playing on it there. But they were also lowbrow humor. Again, cheap laughs. Think fart jokes and poop jokes and things like that is where they were going. with this. But again, it's parody, exaggerate for comic effect, and criticism of public officials. Again, why isn't that slander? Why can you go out? Why can they make fun of the president or someone like that on TV or others? Well, they're in the public eye. They should be open to it. That's the whole idea. And we hold people to a power in ways like that. So let's talk about the Peloponnesian War. You can actually see most of this in the video, so make sure to watch the crash course video on this. But what is this? It's a war between Athens and Sparta that really drags in and will eventually bring down Greece. Sparta is afraid that Athens is getting too powerful, because they were, and so they were, the Athenians had the Delian League, the Spartans had the Peloponnesian League. What really drives this home is Corinth here. Corinth was Athens' main competitor in this. They asked Sparta to stand up to Athens, and the way they did it said, either get Athens off our back or we're joining them. Sparta can't live with this because at this point Sparta has no navy, so it needs Corinth's navy here. Now the other way is how this was framed in Athens. Sparta sends a letter to Athens asking it to back down and stop mistreating its allies. Pericles characterizes this as a demand. He says the Spartans are demanding we step down rather than asking them to. Now there's a difference between a demand and an ask, right? A demand, you're telling them what to do. By framing it this way, Pericles sets up to the assembly and says, look, they're telling us to step down. They're demanding this. If we give in, we show weakness. And if we show weakness, they will continue pushing against us this way. So you can see some of these. Balance of power. Sparta has the advantage on the ground. Athens on the sea. Athens is also wealthier and had more wealth overall. The difference is, and this is going to be the real big difference in the end, Sparta is going to win this because it's willing to align with an outside power, foreign power. Indeed, it makes a deal with Persia in order to defeat Athens. So in many ways, we're going to see, and many viewed Sparta as selling out the Greeks so that it could win this war. It's really going to put a knock on Sparta's reputation. But Pericles here, the popular Athenian general, he realized you can't win in a ground war, so you needed a war of attrition. Let's bleed them dry. We got more resources, more people, that sort of thing. Says let's raid their lands. They're going to try to attack us here. If we go raid their lands, go and hit Sparta from the sea, maybe we'll get the hell out, stop rise, and Sparta will have to bring its forces back home and defend. It also says, let's not get into an infantry battle. We're not going to win these. So even if we got to abandon the farmlands and put everybody inside the city, let's do it. And they did, but it creates lots of problems. A plague runs through Athens, eventually kills Pericles and all that. And even Sparta can never fully surround Athens because they have the long walls there. This was working. However, Pericles dies as part of the plague, and his strategy is abandoned. Why? You have these other generals, Cleon and Alcibiades, who take over, and they want a different approach. They also want their own approach, right? They don't want to give credit to Pericles. What is interesting, the Athenians here were able to force the surrender of the mighty Spartans. About 1,000 to 2,000 of them surrendered or killed. Sparta asked for peace as a result of this. Athens says no, because they get too overconfident here. Eventually, there's a truce for a while, but then it comes back. You can read this. Really make really bad mistakes. Alcibiades will eventually switch sides and sell out the Athenians to the Spartans there. The war end, Sparta makes a deal with the Persians. Again, watch the video on this. And many view it as them selling out mainland Greece here. What we're going to see in the next chapter, this war is going to have significant consequences. They're going to continue fighting within themselves, the Greeks, for years to come, which is going to weaken them and open them up for outsiders. All right, well, that is it. Let me know if you have questions. Thank you.